A ghostly apparition on sentry duty, from Adventures of a Boer Family by Victor Pohl. Of the three brothers who joined the Boer forces, it was Willie who had the keenest sense of humour, and, although fundamentally serious, he never failed to appreciate the funny side of a situation. Stefans, on the other hand, was a born fighter, the sort of man who enjoyed adventure for its own sake, who rarely stopped to think of the consequences when once he had made up his mind, and who often took unwarranted risks. Frederick, who because of his small stature had earned the nickname Taki, a small branch, never looked for trouble, and was more minded to pour oil on troubled waters. But in spite of his lack of weight and inches, and in spite of his peaceable nature, he had the heart of a lion, as those who had known him since childhood could vouch. He was, moreover, possessed of cool and sound judgment, wonderfully keen eyesight, and amazing physical stamina. And it is no wonder that Commandant Henny Bester later referred to him as one of the best scouts the Boers had in the field. At the outbreak of war, Willie was in the Transvaal. At midnight on the 29th of October 1899, he entrained for the Natal front as a volunteer with the Transvaal Commando. The train was packed and sleep was out of the question. When they arrived at Charlestown, they found the place deserted, but one of their men returned from an Indian shop laden with streamers of the Free State and Transvaal colours, and with these they decorated the train. Before they had left Johannesburg, they had been told by one of their English friends that it would take the British only about 3 weeks to capture Pretoria. Being young and full of national ardour, Willie had retorted that the Boers would stalk and shoot them, as they were accustomed to stalking and shooting rock rabbits. When they arrived at Elandslaagte and had to proceed to their positions through a barrage of bursting shells and whining bullets, he himself had a taste of what it felt like to be a hunted rabbit. As they were riding to their positions, and just before they ran the gauntlet of the British fire, a burgher riding at Willie's side, apparently a confirmed fatalist, remarked that it was extremely foolish to be afraid, as not a hair of their heads would be harmed, unless their destined hour had arrived. But with less fatalism, or perhaps with less courage, Willie asked him to point out the largest stone behind which he could take cover when they reached the line. They left their horses in a depression and then moved forward on all fours. Eventually Willie found himself sharing an all too inadequate stone with another burgher. After a few minutes, a shrapnel shell burst right ahead of them and killed his companion. The man rolled over in Willie's direction, and he was horrified to find himself bespattered from head to foot with his blood. He then made a dash for a much larger stone nearby, to find his would-be fatalist friend already in possession, and making the best use of every inch of cover, having evidently forgotten that his moment of departure from this world had been predestined from before the beginning of time. Fighting ceased after darkness set in, and the burghers managed to prepare a hasty meal before proceeding to the Pretoria Commando, some 3 miles away. There Willie found that he was detailed to stand guard over Long Tom, the famous siege gun used by the Boers at Ladysmith. His watch, which was from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., was shared with a young fellow, not much older than himself. After 2 sleepless nights and the nerve-wracking experiences of the day, he found that his hardest fight was against an overwhelming desire for sleep. For one moment of concentration, he would keep awake, but the next he found himself nodding as he stood, and even while he was trying to listen for sounds of approaching enemy. Meanwhile, the other sentry had fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion, in a half-sitting position, but he had taken the precaution of putting the sling of his rifle around his shoulders, for the fact that his rifle had been removed was often used as evidence against a sentry of his having slept on duty. In due course, an officer on his round of inspection noticed the recumbent figure. He approached on tiptoe, but the moment he touched the rifle sling, the defaulter was wide awake, and when the officer accused him of having slept on sentry duty, he said, "Who slept? I saw you and heard you coming, but I took no notice, as my duty is to watch out for the enemy, not my own people." To this plausible defense, the officer had no reply. The next morning, several men had to carry saddles strapped to their backs as punishment for having slept on sentry duty. The frequency of this offence and the inadequate penalties attached to it were due to the mismanagement and the extreme lack of discipline that prevailed during the early stages of the war. Later, when the fighting had become more acute, discipline was much more rigorously enforced. At this time, Willie and his companion shared their tent with a man well past middle age, whom they called Oom Hans, whose temperament was eminently unsuited to the rigours of warfare, and who never adapted himself to the life of a guerrilla soldier. Oom Hans would rather have died than sleep in his trousers, and no matter what the circumstances, he would invariably put on a clean white nightshirt before retiring for the night. One moonlight night, Oom Hans and Willie had been detailed for sentry duty, and during the earlier part of the night, they slept on the veldt, wrapped in their blankets, about 100 yards away from the outposts. They had been warned to be particularly vigilant, as it was expected that the British would make a sortie from Ladysmith. But even on this night, although Oom Hans was very nervous, he again crept into his inevitable nightshirt before wrapping his blankets about him. At about midnight, Willie had a violent attack of biliousness and, not wishing to disturb his companion, made his way as quietly as possible to some nearby stones, hoping that from this distance the sound of vomiting would be inaudible. But Oom Hans woke and saw him, as he was disappearing amongst the bounders in the moonlight, and without a moment's hesitation he scrambled from underneath his blankets and followed at his best pace, thinking no doubt that the enemy was upon them and that Willie was fleeing for his life. He lost sight of Willie almost at once, but seeing one of the sentries about 50 yards away, he made straight for him. This sentry was a youngster of about 18 years, and when he saw a white-robed figure silently advancing in the moonlight, terror seized his young and superstitious mind, and he fled before this ghostly apparition. On his flight to the next sentry post, he passed within 10 yards of where Willie was waging a lone battle against a diet of fat beef. And Willie called to him in the midst of his spluttering, to know what was afoot. The sentry gulped and gasped, but no answer came. He could only lift his rifle and point it at the white figure that followed. As Willie grasped what was happening, he was seized with untimely amusement and had the novel, if grim, experience of laughing and vomiting at the same time.